Okay. All right, guys, given that you crouched down and rough played soccer, let's get into it. Tell us a little bit about where you're crouching, what we're looking at here.
So we're in a pasture of Sardi 7 lucerne, which is a winter active lucerne. What we sowed it on the basis of trying to control, reduce the amount of leakage below the root zone of water as part of managing dryland salinity, and it was also there to increase the summer activity of our pasture systems and offer that extended growing season with high quality feed going into summer and autumn. This stand in particular was sown back in 2004 with some little more work done in 2005, and then allowed to establish when we started grazing in 2006. So it's an 8-year-old pasture that we're looking at. We're going into winter. It's been through some grazing in autumn, and as you can see, there's a bit of annuals and Cape wheat winter grass, as well as the subclover that was sown with it coming through the stand.
So what have the results been and what have you found out?
Well, picking up on that point Ralph made, it is a semi-winter active lucerne, so that means that one of the key things is that we're getting winter production. That didn't work.
Okay, tell us a little bit. Tell us what.
Sorry.
No, Anita, can you tell us what the variety is and what you're hoping to get out of this particular trial?
Yeah, so this is a Sardi 7, a semi-winter active variety of lucerne. One of the myths was that if you get summer activity, you're not going to have winter production, but with some of these new cultivars, we're getting winter activity. And we found as a result of this, as a result of the Evergraze trial, we found that we were getting comparable winter production or growth rates from this pasture compared to a ryegrass pasture on the same part of the landscape. So obviously the annuals are contributing to that as well, but it's also the fact that we've got a semi-winter active variety of lucerne here, which is good for grazing systems because it means that they don't lose production at a really important part of the year over that winter period coming into spring. And I guess the other thing on the flip side of that is that the lucerne obviously is summer active, so one of the other key results was reduced supplementary feed. So we found here that in the drought of 06-07, it cost us about $20 per head for the ewes that were in containment. So the ewes that actually had access to lucerne got through that dry period without any supplement, and that equated to about $300 per hectare of reduced supplementary feed cost, which practically covers the cost of establishment for that lucerne in that dry year.
And what are some of the on-farm implications in terms of flexibility of production systems?
So adding lucerne to the system not only provides that extension of the growing season, but adds some flexibility to when feed is grown at what time of year. By having good high quality feed available during normally a dry feed, poor quality time of year, allows you to potentially flush ewes for joining, allows you to grow out weaners at the rates that improve survival, and as Anita mentioned, it saves on that supplementary feeding cost and bill at the end of the day. And the modelling that we've done on the Evergraze project over a long term has shown that if with a little bit of lucerne in the system, around that 25% mark for a farm, what it does is it takes off the extremes and allows our gross margins to have less variability over time, and you're really improving the bottom end of your performance, whereas a full perennial ryegrass system, which is what we modelled against, actually has larger extremes and more variability in gross margin.
So what would you have to say to farmers that are hesitant to establish lucerne because it has a reputation of being difficult to establish and hard to maintain?
So the lucerne takes some extra work to get established. We had to apply lime. It takes all the same amount of work in terms of the bed preparation, cultivation, making sure that we're clean and weed free when we're going in for sowing, but in general it's about the same cost and the same establishment aside from the lime and some extra management. So if you can grow lucerne, you probably should. The things that we did and made sure is that it was put in the right place on the landscape, making sure that it has a free draining soil because it isn't tolerant of waterlogging.
Any other take-home messages regarding lucerne? New varieties suiting higher rainfall or soil types?
Not only that, I suppose there's now some grazing tolerant varieties, so that it still performs better under rotational grazing, but it means that you can be a bit more lax and get away with it without the impacts of poor persistence.
So lucerne under rotational grazing will persist for quite a long time. This, as we mentioned before, this stands 8 years old. If you do set stock it, then the grazing tolerant varieties will hold up better, but you still wouldn't want to do that for a long time, otherwise you'll wipe it out.
Where do people go for more information?
The Evergraze website, www.evergraze.com.au.
Or their local agronomist, Marius.
Ari.
Great. I just on that last call to action, if we can just sort of get a full answer.
Yeah.
Cool. And,
So yeah, to start with, if you'd like more information,
The other thing, we'll stop. But
Yep.
the other thing is about companion species.
Yeah. If you want to
No,
say
okay, don't say it. Go.
we can do companion
No,
species
no,
and
you
more
go,
information if you want.
go,
But
no, no, no.
for more
So-
information,
For more information on lucerne and the management of lucerne, you can go to the Evergraze website, www.evergraze.com.au, or see your local agronomist for extra information about different varieties and management and spraying recommendations.
Crumpy, Lisa, anything else?
We-
How are your knees
Yeah,
going,
I'm
Ralph?
happy. Sorry,
Um,
I bumped my flash and it went off. But
Yeah, that's fine. If we maybe we could just get.
Well, good question, Maris. What we're looking at here is just an access point that we've got a metal tube going into the ground, and it allows us to look at soil moisture and access down to deep depths in the soil. We've gone down to about 5 metres in depth measuring soil moisture, and what we're actually interested in is how much moisture gets used within the root zone from lucerne. And what we've found on this side is lucerne can draw water from down to 5 metres and utilise that for growth. So what we're getting is a dry soil buffer below lucerne that really stops any recharge or leakage of water below the root zone, helps with the control of dryland salinity, but it also provides that buffer of rainfall that gets able to store it up and used for lucerne growth and extending the growing season.
So there's a environmental benefit as well as a production benefit.
Yep, so and that leads to our environmental benefit and a production benefit from lucerne. Shown through the use of lucerne, we've able to increase water use, reduce recharge and leakage of water below the root zone, which has an impact on dryland salinity. But we've also, through our recommendations around feed on offer and rotational grazing, we can manage the amount of ground cover that's here during autumn and going into winter. And that has important ramifications for levels of erosion and wind erosion through basically mechanisms like destocking at the right times and the right thresholds of feed on offer or ground cover.
Just pick up that last line.
Yep.
So let's get that entire line.
Yep.
Broken up.
So Evergraze utilises thresholds of feed on offer and ground cover to manage when you need to destock, to manage for control of erosion and make sure that ground cover thresholds aren't exceeded. Well, no, ground cover, it's not that way. Ground cover thresholds are, I'm just trying to think of the right way. So it's the amount of bare area. So bare area, and the amount of bare area isn't too large, causing increased erosion. That's the.
Let's get that line again. So
Yeah.
So is it about maintaining ground cover?
Yeah, it's about maintaining ground cover. So yeah.
Tell us a little bit about why it's important to maintain ground cover and how Evergraze can help manage that.
Okay. Once farms get more than 30% bare areas on their paddocks, some of those bare areas start to interconnect and you get increased wind erosion and water erosion on pastures. Managing for the amount of feed on offer and not exceeding thresholds of around 800 kilograms of feed on offer in terms of dry matter, depending on the part of the landscape, and making sure that those barriers don't exceed about 30% of the ground cover, then you're able to control that wind erosion and potential soil water erosion from rainfall as well. I stuffed that one up too.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, you just pick up the last line, but you're fine.
Just that
Yep.
last line about water erosion, wasn't it?
Controlling erosion.
So by making sure that your bare areas don't exceed 30% and making sure there's sufficient ground cover in terms of dry matter and feed on offer means that you're controlling potentially erosion from wind and soil. I've stuffed it up. Water from rainfall. I'll do that again, one more time.
Sorry, Ralph.
Yeah, it's because I'm thinking soil water, which is different. Anyway.
It might help just by having like a beat, a pause between if you want,
Yeah.
to sort of collect your thought and then sort of continue on.
Yeah. So by managing ground cover to ensure that there's not more than 30% bare area, we're able to make sure that we've got sufficient ground cover, and that allows us protection from wind erosion and also erosion potentially from rainfall. That's probably.
Whilst you're there, Ralph, I'll
Yep.
just get one more question. You've had a lot of field days and things here. How have farmers interacted with this particular site? You've had a lot of field days over a number of years.
Yep.
What's been the feedback to farmers and what? Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Okay, Evergraze has had a big involvement with producers throughout the region and also nationwide, as we're a project that has a number of sites across the country. This particular site, we've had close to over 10,000 visits in terms of people participating and visiting and seeing our events. But we also know from evaluation that we've had 3,000 producers nationwide adopt change practices from things they've learnt from Evergraze. And we know in this region alone, in southeast South Australia and southern Victoria, that there's been around 1,900 producers change practice resulting from Evergraze.
Great. That last line was actually quite powerful about how many farmers have changed practice.
Yeah, I could see that as an overlay,
It
but
was-
we can get it
It
anyway.
was just, can we just get it one more time?
What's been the impact of farmers here? How many visited here? And what the,
And also I just want to get a tighter shot as well.
Yeah.
It is quite impactful.
I could see that as an overlay, 1900, but we can, if we can do it as as audio, that'd be good as well.
1 second. Okay, so yeah, again, I mean, like if you're gonna do eye lines to somebody,
Yeah.
that'd be Marius.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we just go stand around and sort of point to things and do.
Okay,
Ready to go?
ready to go?
Levels
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, we're good.
You framed up? See, I can use terms like framed up. Right, Ralph, tell us about exactly what we're looking at here and the significance of it in terms of Evergraze.
Okay, we're just here on the Evergraze site looking at the perennial ryegrass pasture system. What we've got here is a Fitzroy perennial ryegrass on the crest, a Avalon perennial ryegrass on the slope, which is the next paddock down, and a Banquet perennial ryegrass on the valley floor, which is the third species in our perennial ryegrass system. And the aim of those different species is to utilise the different characteristics of the soil and match the right plant with the right part of the landscape for both persistence and productivity and profitability. So what we've got is a Fitzroy perennial ryegrass, which is an earlier maturing perennial ryegrass cultivar, and it can cope with the drier environment on the crests, which has a freer draining soil. And then we have a Banquet perennial ryegrass, which is a longer, later maturing variety, and it's on our valley floor, and it allows us to take advantage of the longer amount of soil moisture, the higher water holding capacity of that valley floor, and the fact that we can get a longer growing season in that part of the landscape. So that gives us our perennial ryegrass system. In comparison on the Evergraze site, and we talked about Sardi 7 Lucerne before, what we had was Sardi 7 on the crests, an Avalon perennial ryegrass on the slope, and a summer active tall fescue on the valley floor, and that provided us a system with increased summer activity. Now both those perennial pasture systems basically increased our productivity by more than 50%, and we were able to increase lamb production to up to 400 to 600 kilograms of lamb live weight per hectare, and wool production up to 50 to 60 kilograms of clean wool per hectare. That's in comparison to something like 200 kilograms lamb live weight per hectare for the benchmarked area, and around 30 to 40 kilograms of wool per hectare in the benchmarked area in this region. So, you know, substantial increases in productivity just by being able to match new cultivars, highly improved pastures with good fertility, matched to the landscape, and then putting them in the right place with the right sort of management, and then having a good animal system across the top.
What are the on-farm implications of this diversity as well?
So what you're seeing here is a bit of a mosaic, so providing some diversity and some spacing and you know, spatial differentiation between the landscape, and that allows us to utilise different parts of the landscape differently and optimise production. And we know every farm is unique and has its own particular assets. So if you've got areas that can have, you know, a longer growing season because they've got higher water holding capacity, you know, valley floors, you can take advantage of them by just matching the species to that area of the landscape. Likewise, if you've got drier soils or hilltops, it may provide an opportunity for you to put something in like lucerne that is able to use deep soil moisture and you know, doesn't like waterlogging, so it's able to enjoy the free draining soils.
So is the bottom line essentially farming to land use capability? Is that the take-home message from this?
So a good land use message is really about matching species and cultivar to the landscape, using the right plant, right place, right management and right purpose, and that allows you to make the most out of your particular land capability.
So do you suggest farmers fence?
Can we just get that?
You want that one again? 'Cause
Yeah.
Yeah. So where do we start with that? So yeah, is this essentially a take-home message of farming to land use capability, that last?
Yeah, so basically by using the right plant in the right place with the right sort of management and purpose in terms of its animal production system, we're able to make the optimum use out of the land capability and the land class, and achieve sort of maximum productivity per hectare.
And what do you suggest in terms of fencing to land types?
Yeah, don't suggest anything. I'll just go. The thing with fencing is land class fencing. It's recommended from a catchment perspective, and it allows you to more effectively control grazing and stock, but it's not going to be suitable to all areas. And but that doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't utilise different species in certain areas of paddock.
So Ralph, how do you know this has made a difference for farmers?
So evaluation of the Evergraze project at a national perspective has shown that around 3,000 producers nationally has been changed practices as a result of participating in Evergraze and learning new practices. What we also know is that the evaluation in this particular region around southeast South Australia and also Victoria, around 1,900 producers have changed practices as a result of Evergraze information. So. Good.
Okay. Happy, Crumpy? All right,
Okay.
good. So thank you for that. And obviously the aerial shot will be a great overlay for that too.
Yep.
Grazed down, then probably would have been, you know, 500 kilogram residual. Got a thunderstorm in February. Fortnight later there was 2,500 kilos of dry matter, high quality feed that you could put lambs on that were, you know, doing 250 grams a day. You know, what other pasture does that? There's none. Not for this environment. Yeah.
So do you think the environmental benefits and the production benefits working well together with when it comes to Evergraze? I mean, the two seem to go hand in hand.
Oh, definitely, yeah. It's reduced groundwater runoff and yeah, and the other benefits, well, yeah, better animal production and not putting pressure on. The other thing it actually does from that point of view is, like at times you can have stock on here and rest your winter active pastures instead of overgrazing them and keep ground cover on those paddocks that in the past would have been probably overgrazed below sort of minimum target levels. So it's definitely made a difference in that respect. Yes.
Crumpy, you wanted to ask a question about being the chair of the ERG. I'll just let Crumpy answer that one.
Well, I guess I just getting an idea on, you know, being involved in research from more the ground level, so having a say into the research project and working with researchers, so getting a, you know, instead of learning about the research out of magazines or in the paper, you're actually there as it's happening.
Yeah.
Driving it.
So yeah, maybe if we can get an open-ended question such as what's been your relationship with Evergraze all up? So
Yeah.
how have you been involved with it?
Oh,
Yeah,
you want me to answer that now?
that's right. So what's been your association with Evergraze?
Well, I've been involved in Evergraze right from the beginning on the ARG, which is the Evergraze Regional Group. So we're an advisory group to the proof site at Hamilton, and I was invited to go on to that group, and I've been on that since the start of the project. And then part way through, the original chair stepped down and I took over as chair of the group. But yeah, so I've been involved from the start, and what that's meant for me is, like, you know, developing a good association with researchers and other people on the group, which are, you know, plant breeder science and, you know, people from the CMA. Like there's a broad range of people on the group. So yeah, no, it's been invaluable, and other farmers and their experiences, which is I've benefited from it greatly, actually, been having a close association to the research there. Yes.
And are you happy with the results of Evergraze all up?
Yeah. Generally, I think there's been some good outcomes, particularly in this area. You know, the use of summer actives, which perennial summer actives as opposed to annuals. You know, there's been basically with new plant varieties, and that research that was done years ago with lucerne, like, means nothing compared to what's happened now. The result, like, even the researchers were surprised, and the program they used, Midas, to calculate stocking rate, they way underestimated what it's actually achieved. So yeah, it's been of high value in that respect. So from my point of view, it's given me the confidence to go ahead and do it. Whereas some farmers, well, am I going to spend the first dollar is the hardest dollar to spend? Whereas when you looked at the research results and the results they've got, well, it was pretty. You just go and do it, pretty much, if you've got the land suitable. Well, that was my approach to it. Yeah.
I think that's pretty perfect.
I just wonder.
Grow straight lucerne or
No. Well, you can see here, this is not pure lucerne.
and it's easy to mix it? Grow it with companions?
Well, the only companion here.
Maybe just get this to Mario, just if we want to use this as a pickup.
Oh yeah.
This is actually this is off camera, but this is by Reg Hill.
Taking my questions out, so if I say, what does Evergraze mean to you? You say, well, what Evergraze means to me is, you know, this. So because they're cutting me out of it. Don't look so crampy.
Was that a question?
No. That's not. Right, we're just going to get. We're not going to. We're just going to get going.
This is not going to go well.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine.
Oh
It'll
dear.
be fine. Right, Ari, tell us when you're ready.
Just put back inside. Great. Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, well, Peter, first of all, thanks for having us here, and I was hoping you could perhaps introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about where we're standing and what's behind you.
All right, I'm Peter Hayes, and I'm a farmer, I suppose a wool grower, and we live just, what are we, west of Dunkeld, yes, in Western Victoria.
So let's just do that again and look lovingly in my eyes.
It's not as easy as you think. Righto,
Just introduce yourself.
take two. Righto,
Yep.
go now. Yep, I'm Peter Hayes, and I farm west of Dunkeld in southwest Victoria.
And what are we standing in here?
And we're standing in, this was the first lucerne paddock I sowed. This would be a 6-year-old stand of Sardi 7, and we're in the autumn, of course, so the lucerne's grazed down reasonably well, yes.
So what's been your association with Evergraze?
Well, with Evergraze, I've been on the committee since the start of the program, and then sort of about halfway through I became chair of our local ERG. So yeah, I've had involvement right from the start and input, yes.
How have you incorporated lucerne into your production system, and what has it meant?
Oh, well, I've incorporated in by picking the right paddocks and yes, and getting soil tests and everything done and establishing lucerne. And what it's meant actually is quite a bit actually. It's extended our growing season at sort of both ends really. It extends our spring. It's been able to respond to summer rainfall events, plus, well, we're in the autumn now and we've had a late break, but I've been still able to grow high quality feed in my lucerne paddocks. Not the volumes I have other years, but still better than most of our other perennial winter active pastures.
And what has it meant from an animal production point of view?
Oh, from an animal production point of view, it's been quite outstanding really. Our merino lambs usually rotate off it, and since I've had enough lucerne in, like our lambs, their daily growth rates over, say, from weaning till May, September lamb, sort of around that 50 grams, and we had last year we peaked at they averaged close to 100 grams daily growth rate, so they were pretty good merino lambs without much effort, pretty much done by the pastures in the paddock. Yeah.
And I mean, ewe weaners are notoriously difficult to manage. What's lucerne done for ewe weaner production?
Well, with our ewe weaners, it's made a big difference by getting those early growth rates, and we join at rising 2-year-olds there. Our conception rates have increased, by probably 25% at least. Yes, so we've been able to get them to those. Well, they're at those target joining weights well before they need to be, and the other side's been our wool production, sound of wool, all that's been an add-on as well.
So where have you established lucerne on your property, and why?
Well, we've picked the drier paddocks, and which have been the suitable soil types. Initially, I didn't rush into sowing lucerne because the perceived downside was there'd be no winter production, and you wanted your drier paddocks in the winter. But the Evergrey side at Hamilton's proved that to be a myth, and actually, in some winters, it actually outperformed drygrass pastures. So we went forward with it with a lot more confidence, and we've picked those paddocks, and I think there's only about 20% of my farm that's actually totally suitable to it. So I've only got one more paddock left that I could probably sow to lucerne, and then for summer actives we have to look at something else like fescues, which we sowed a paddock last spring to a summer active fescue, and that's my first paddock of that. So we'll see how that fits into the system, but it's looking pretty good so far.
And what's it like to establish? Some people say it's hard to establish and hard to maintain.
No, if you follow all the general establishment rules, do the right sprays at the right time, and pest control, do an appropriate soil test, use the right nutrients. I haven't had any issues with establishment. No problems at all. I've heard locally in the district people have had problems, but me myself, no. Like it's I've had pretty good results every time.
So what would you have to say to?
Can we just get that one?
Yeah.
Just a bit
Sorry.
of paper rustling.
So, what's it? There isn't a perception that it's hard to establish and hard to maintain, but has that been your experience?
No, that hasn't been my experience. If you follow all the rules and plan well ahead, like you probably want to plan a year, 2 years ahead with lucerne, like get your lime on the year before, and follow all the rules. Get your sprays done early so you conserve moisture. I haven't had any issues with establishment. Like no different to establishing any other pasture actually. Yeah, I've found it actually. I think it's a lot tougher than people make out. But if you follow the rules, no, I haven't had any problems. No, but I think some people have gone in and sowed too late. Like it's sowing it at the right time in the spring sowing if your spring cuts off. But last spring cut off, and I sowed a paddock last spring, and it's probably the best result I've had. So, but it was sprayed out early, and all the rules were followed, and I got a good result.
So overall, what would you have to say to farmers about lucerne and incorporating into a farming operation?
Well, if you've got soil types that are suitable, I'd definitely be looking at it. But depends what production system you're running and when you want to grow your feed. But if you want early autumn feed and a pasture that will respond to summer rainfall, well, I'd be looking at it.
Now,
Just get that again, contextualise it, full answer. Just sort of mentioning more of the mentioning of lucerne as opposed to it, just so we can have it in context.
okay.
Oh, right, yeah.
That's all right.
So what?
Yeah, so what would you have to say to farmers about around Australia about lucerne, about the possibilities that it offers?
Well, farmers around Australia with lucerne, if they've got paddocks that are suitable and in a climate that's suitable should be considering it if it suits their production system. If they're struggling to have feed at each end of the season and they get some summer rainfall, well, they should definitely be considering it because it'll add to their system. It'll be of a benefit.
So, just the last question. In terms of evergraze, the principles of evergraze of putting the right plant in the right position and the right purpose to increase productivity and profit. What's been your interpretation of that on this property?
Oh well, we were going down the path of saying perennial pastures anyway, mainly phalaris on our heavier ground, and it's like a winter active pasture, but.
So So what have you planted lucerne with? I suppose. How have you managed it?
Our lucerne stands. I've got 4 paddocks now, and this paddock here was the first, and we sowed fescue with it, but at a very low rate. So you just have the plants you can see the fescue stems there. There's just a plant here and there, and that's more for balancing diet because lucerne can be pretty red hot. And then the rest is annuals, and I don't get too concerned about them. You can graze them out through grazing or cut it early for hay is what I do before the annual seed. That works quite well. Whereas other paddocks I've sowed phalaris, but same at a very low rate, so you just end up with a plant here and there. And I also sow subclover with it as well because subclover will drive your winter stocking rate because your lucerne does not grow as much through the winter, of course, but so it's the other species that'll run your winter stocking rate. So the clover works quite well because it finishes off and then the lucerne comes through. I did sow one stand with chicory and that works okay, but the insects love the chicory and so they come in and eat the chicory and that's the paddock I have the most insect problems on in my situation here. So I wouldn't recommend that myself, but some people have done it and it works quite well for them, but on my farm, it's just, there's management issues with it. So and you're limited with spray controls at times. Not that I use a lot of spraying, but it's more the broadleaf spraying. Yeah.
Now I know you're enthusiastic about R&D on farm anyway, on farm R&D.
Yeah.
We won't touch on that.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about how your association with Evergraze has changed or enhanced your perspective of research and being very much at the coalface of it and being involved with it.
Oh, well, being involved in Evergraze for me and being involved directly with research, it's invaluable to have local relevant research that's specific to your area. Yeah, it makes a huge difference because Evergraze has shown as a project, like there's been different results in the different regions, like Wagga, they've found other species that work well, although lucerne happens to be one of them, but other things have worked well there, and in the west it's been kikuyu, and then in Queensland it's been some of the tropical species. So whereas that local relevant research, well, we can't. Look, we tried a tropical species down here, kikuyu, and it didn't work. So, and that's not a bad thing. That's probably people who go all that far. Well, it's a good thing. Well, we know not to use it, or if you're going to use it, you've got to be careful where you use it. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely invaluable because it's in your own region. You've got the confidence to use it. Whereas if you see something from another region, producers say, oh well, that worked up there, that'll never work down here, sort of attitude. So yeah, because climates, soil types vary. But even within our region, there's a huge variation. But yeah, if it's more local, it's more likely to be uptake of the local producers.
So has Evergraze been a good example of local research for local gain in that sort of sense, and a good adaptation of national research?
Yeah, I reckon just driving around here, like with research, there's that trickle-down effect. You notice, particularly in the summer, like 10 years ago, you wouldn't have noticed a lucerne paddock, whereas, you do notice quite a few driving around now, and people would say, well, it may not have been because of Evergraze, but with the trickle-down effect, it's created that interest, and there's been lots of articles written, and there's a couple of agronomists on the ERG. I'm sure it's had an impact. Well, I'm positive it has.
Oh, so that's good. Have you noticed that Ari breathes a little bit like Darth Vader?
Who does?
Ari. It's you. You're the problem, mate. I was wondering what's that sound. It sounds like you are my son.
We'll edit that bit out.
Yeah, we got him in. Okay, so just wanted to tell us a bit about these sheep, and I guess if you can almost tell us how, what the impact has had of Evergraze on these sheep, and
yeah,
if that's a good question.
Yeah, so will I start?
Do you talk,
Yeah, and
talk to me
oh,
or
again,
to?
Maurice, yeah, so.
So just start talking.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
start
what are we
talking.
looking at here?
These are rising 3-year-old wethers that were shorn a month ago, and they've been fattened for the either the domestic or export mutton trade. So with the Evergraze principles, like the autumn's always a traditionally hard time to put weight on sheep, so because the lucerne still grows into the autumn before the other pastures get going, and these are the tail end. I've been able to put a reasonable amount of weight on them, and hopefully they'll be sold in the next month or within the next month.
What about lifetime ewe management on these particular sheep?
Oh, well, on my ewe portion, how the lucerne pastures fit in. Well, with managing my lucerne so far, over the summer I've pretty much used it to run my merino lambs on, because I've got pretty good other perennial pastures that are okay for the ewes, but I do scan my ewes, so my twin ewes have been, I do lamb down on the lucerne, so I've been set stocking twin ewes to lamb down on the lucerne, and that's worked pretty well too. So like there's sort of 3 classes of stock pretty much graze it through the year, so lambs over the summer, into the autumn, shear my wethers there on it for sort of a month to round them up to sell them, and then they go off, and then it's shut up for a while, and then I shear my lambs, and then the lambs go onto the lucerne off shears, so they're on high quality feed for a few weeks, and then back onto the normal pastures, and then it's shut up again, and then I scan my ewes, and then the twin bearing ewes go onto the lucerne prior to lambing. So that's pretty much the system I've been using with these pastures.
You're
Yeah.
obviously happy with how it works.
Oh, it's been working really well. Yeah. So
If we can get that again.
No, we can't. The sheep have gone.
sheep are gone.
No, just a thing
Brendan,
about like
what are we doing?
It's almost like a one line, just saying, you know, like Evergraze just works, you know. Something like that. It's
Yeah,
I mean,
okay, well.
somehow I know it's contrived, but if we can get.
Oh, well, not ever. That's how it's worked for me, because I run a different. For other farmers, it's going to be different.
Yeah.
That for my production system, that's how I've used the Evergraze.
That's how Evergraze has worked for me. So
Like Evergraze is about growing the grass, and they did run a livestock system on it there, but we don't all run that livestock system. So you look at the research and, well, how can I use this for my livestock system? That's how I use it, because I run a self-replacing merino flock, whereas they used a dual-purpose merino joined to a terminal. Totally different system. So, and feed demand's a bit different at different times of the year.
But you have been able to adapt a significant amount of it to your farm.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Well, we nearly got it, but you just didn't quite.
Yeah, well, I have.
Enthusiasm, but I can't
Yeah.
put it in one little
No, well, the Evergraze principles, I've pretty much adapted it to my farm. Well, I have adapted it to my farm. I was going down that path of putting in summer actives and looking at it, but since being involved with Evergraze, done it with a lot more confidence, and and how it's worked for me, as I said, well, the summer actives get used for lambs from weaning. They go onto the summer actives till the autumn break, and then after the autumn break, we autumn shear. So the oldest age group of wethers, which are rising 3-year-olds, get shorn, go on to lucerne to round them up to be sold sort of 3 weeks off shears, and then after that it's shut up again, and then I shear my lambs in late autumn, and then they've got high quality feed to go onto off shears, because their feed demand is going to be a lot higher coming off shears for a few weeks. So that solves that problem, and then after that, ewes are scanned, and then twinning ewes usually go onto the lucerne.
So Evergraze.
And that's how I'm using the Evergraze pasture systems for my livestock system, which is a self-replacing merino flock, and it's been working fantastically well. You know, production levels are as good as they've ever been. Enough?
Sometimes the rest is as long as 120 days. It averages around about 80 days. With that rest period, we find that the recruitment and the thickening of the perennial grass species has just been fantastic, outstanding. It really just loves that sort of management. I can add to that too if you like. I'll add a bit more. At certain times of the year, it's really beneficial for the native pastures to have a spell, and so we manage the integration of the native and the improved pastures by knowing when the natives really enjoy a spell and taking the stock off and having them whilst around the improved pastures, And conversely, when the improved pastures, particularly Phalaris, needs a spell through seed setting, if we want to thicken the sward, we'll utilise our native pastures to carry the stock during that period of time.
How will you use this new system and the Evergrowth principles, say, moving forward, and when we've got greater variability of seasons, or with variability of seasons, how do you change your management?
Yep, okay. Managing a farm in a more variable climate is quite a challenge that we're getting our mind around. We find that with deep-rooted perennials is probably the answer for us here, managing and maintaining a good swath of deep-rooted perennials that respond quickly to rainfall, last longer, extend the growing season, produce more. So where we have improved pastures that require adequate fertiliser, we do lots of soil testing and make sure everything's just right for them. For the native pastures, we manage them with our rotational grazing system, and because we've got a wonderful suite of grasses out there, the biodiversity is wonderful. We now have a pasture species that's just ready to burst into life whenever rain falls, no matter what time of the year it is.
How have you been able to make a change on your bottom line? So how has Evergraze actually resulted in a change in the profitability here?
Okay. Evergraze has increased our profit from a number of perspectives. One is we were continually spending money sowing pasture species, and with our rotational grazing and understanding of right place, in the right plant in the right place, has enabled us to maintain the deep-rooted perennials indefinitely. So that's saved an enormous amount of money each year in upgrading pastures. We also, with our rotational grazing, we're managing our worm burdens in our sheep much, much better now. We used to drench 6-7 times a year in the old days under the set stock regime. Now we're finding with our rotational grazing, our mobs are all together. We can manage them with the fetal egg counts very, very simply. One egg count will do thousands of sheep rather than lots of egg counts. And our wool quality is improved enormously through the rotational grazing and the extended grass growing period, because we're managing this diverse suite of pasture species. Our wool quality is consistent right through our flocks, because our flocks are much larger now, rather than have little groups everywhere that were all different. For instance, our ewes all come in as one great big mob from 2 to 5, and the wool lines are consistent right through the shed. It made a huge difference to us.
Can we get pass that answer again? I just want to hear again. Whenever you're ready.
All right. Thanks again, Chris, for having us here this morning and taking us around. Just to start, could we just maybe get a bit of background on Womargama, so how big it is, what you're running in the...
Yeah, sure. Okay. Womargama Station's 6,700 hectares. We have two main enterprises. One is a 10,000 fine wool merino flock and 1,000 head self-replacing Hereford cattle herd. We have a very mixed landscape at Womargama. We have a number of different land classifications which have great opportunities and challenges. 800 hectares or so is highly improved, mainly Phalaris pastures, and that's the engine room of the operation. And the rest of the country is either timber or native pastures, which contribute in a different way.
How much rainfall do you get?
750 millimetres rainfall, predominantly spring pasture growth.
Okay. And how many sheep are you running?
We run 10,000 fine wool merino sheep.
How do you get all, so you've got 600 or 800 hectares of improved pasture and the rest is variable. How do you get it all working in tune and singing?
Good question. We embarked upon a rotational grazing program a number of years ago after a visit to the Broadford trial and doing significant research. We were continually disappointed in our perennials dropping out of the system under a set stock regime, and we recognised that a simple rotation would be worth trialling for us, so we did. To set that up in the grazing blocks or cells as they're termed, we found that there was a mix of country in each of the cells, and as we got our minds around rotating through different classifications of country, we recognised that that became quite an advantage rather than disadvantage, and we forced ourselves to release that mindset of matching each land classification to a specific group of stock. Rather, we clumped it together in a broader categorisation and then ran the best large mob that suited that environment.
So Evergrowth is all about the right plant, the right place, and the right purpose. How, I guess, drill in a bit more on how you're using this approach on Womargama.
Okay. Evergraze is about the right plant, the right place, the right purpose, the right management. Our aim is to grow grass all year round. And in our early days, we tried with a suite of different species to grow grass to respond. We found that during the drought was a big lesson for us, that many of those species didn't persist. And then we recognised we had a tremendous asset in the native pastures which persisted right through the drought, but we needed to learn to use them better. So with the rotational grazing system and subdivision and some water and mobbing, putting large mobs together, we now manage that rotational, manage the native pastures in a much better method, and find that we have now pastures that respond to rainfall all year round. Our Phalaris is the engine room of the whole show, but there are times of year when that needs a rest, and our native pastures can take over the role of fattening our stock at that time. There are some times when the native pastures need a break, and it's wonderful that it coincides with the time when the Phalaris really needs a good hard flogging. So we set up our rotation so the stock can be roughly in the spots where the environment needs it the most.
How do you ensure you don't flog the natives too much and overgraze them?
In managing the native pastures, we recognise that at different times of the year they require different length of time to spell. Sometimes of the year they really would like 80 days spell, some 60, sometimes of the year even 120 days. And our Phalaris is much the same. Sometimes we find we need to come around it every 20 days and other times it can be 60 days. It sounds complex, but once you become intuitive and we can, no, I'm not explaining that very well, am I, Simon? I'll have to think that's getting far too complex. Ask that question again, I'll think of a better way of answering it. Oh yeah.
In the next shot, it won't be there.
Yeah, that's right. Vanished.
No one will know. Hopefully, Jane will know. What was how you're not overgrazing the? Like how do you best manage the natives to ensure their persistence?
Okay. I had to learn how to manage the native pastures, and we find that the native pastures really like a good hard flogging and then a rest. Sometimes this sort of research and development we'll be condemning ourselves to a continually reduced return to equity, less investment. We won't be able to feed the world.
For farmers who are looking at you know, maybe taking up some of the Evergrowth principles, what's some of the, where should they start? Where do you suggest they start?
That's a good question.
There's no rush.
No, I'm just thinking of the answer. I don't know. From my perspective, I started asking questions and seeking answers, and Evergraze was there as a resource that I was aware of. I don't know how the average Joe gets onto Evergraze. That's a question I don't know the answer to, really.
Maybe different from the people watching, because it's pretty good statements.
Well, I guess how's it made running this place more efficient? How running stock as larger mobs? How are you seeing a change in your efficiency?
Evergraze has improved our profit from many different perspectives. One is, the first obvious one is that we're not re-sowing pastures all the time, because we've got the right plant in the right place with the right management. The plants are staying there, and the rotational grazing has a lot to do with that, and managing the fertiliser regime and soil testing as well. The rotational grazing means that our mobs are now big mobs, and we manage them much better. For instance, our feed leg counts, we can do a feed leg count on 4,000 sheep in one hit rather than having to do 10, 400 mobs. And our animal health has improved enormously. Under the old regime, we would have drenched our ewes 5, 6, 7 times a year sometimes. Now we're doing it once, twice, 3 times, maybe in a really bad year. So that's been a significant improvement. Our animal health generally has been much better because we're out seeing all of the stock once a week as we move them from paddock to paddock. Our wool lines have improved, our wool quality has really improved because it's consistent. We're bringing big lines of sheep in. For instance, our ewes run in a mob between 2 and 5 years old. They all come into the shed, bring them in sections out of that big mob. The same lines go right through the shed. The newtons are the same, the colours the same, the quality is the same right through. Whereas in the old set stocking regime, one mob of ewes would be different from another to another to another, and we'd have lots of different lines and it was much more complex. So it's really simplified our management, it's simplified our stock work, it's enabled to watch our stock, manage their condition score, manage wool quality, manage our pasture base so much better than in the old days.
Do you think Evergraze is for everyone then? Do you think anyone can pick up these principles of right plant, right place, right purpose and put them on their own farms?
I think one of the beauties of Evergraze is that there's an overriding principle. Right plant, right place, right purpose, right management. And that's for everybody. But embedded in that are a suite of tools, and not all of the tools are for everybody because everybody's farm is different. People have different perspectives, different ambitions, different environments, starting from a different base. So therefore, I believe the principles can be put out everywhere, but the actual tools that people will adopt, the pieces that are right for them, they'll be specific to the farmer. So it's quite a unique and interesting thing, Evergraze.
You've also been involved in Evergraze from a National Advisory Committee level, so actually from a higher level than, say, most farmers. Could you just go over what that involvement is in a bit more detail? Or tell us about that involvement?
Yep. Which bit?
Oh, just managing on the NAC and the ERG.
So what do you want to get out of that?
I just want to get how, the research is being driven by farmers.
Yep. Okay. Good. Ripper. All right. No worries. I was lucky enough to be involved in Evergraze at a strategic level as chairman of the National Advisory Committee for a number of years. The National Advisory Committee provides strategic advice to the key funders. It's been really good because Evergraze, one of the strengths of Evergraze, I think, is the relationship that key producers have had to the development of Evergraze right from its earliest days. It's been about us asking the questions and the researchers coming up with the answers, and that's a great process rather than the other way around. We've been encouraged, inspired, questioned continuously for the things that limit our productivity. We've been asked what things do we do really well, what things would we like to do better, what things do we do really badly, what are the barriers to productivity growth, barriers to adoption to some of those tools. And so it's been, I think, a tremendous process of getting the producers to drive the research. It's been very good.
How's that changed your perspective on how research is done, or even the importance of research?
Okay. Farming's a pretty tough game, particularly if you're measuring it in relation to return to equity. Our costs are going up the whole time. We have no control over our commodity prices, or very little. One of the things we need to continually do is strive for productivity growth. We've got to be growing and doing things more efficiently, reduce our cost of production. Things like Evergraze provide us with the tools to improve our efficiencies, to reduce our cost of production. If we don't have
What questions should people be asking when looking at implementing the Evergraze principles on their farm? What questions should they ask?
As a farm manager, I'm constantly looking for areas to improve efficiency, to increase productivity growth. Constantly asking myself, what can I do better? What's the next barrier? What's stopping me from achieving that next goal? I found that when I engaged with Evergraze, through the website, through researchers, through universities, whichever way, there's often other people who are asking the same question. and there are a bunch of researchers and scientists and extension officers that will either be able to steer you in the right direction or help design a program. In our earlier days, that's how Evergraze started, with us asking questions and the researchers finding out the answers to the barriers. How do we do this better? So I think the first thing I did that engaged me with Evergraze was continually questioning, what do I need to do better? And I found that engaging with Evergraze gave me the answer to a lot of those questions.
Did you get many answers from interacting with other farmers involved in Evergraze?
Yeah, sure. Evergraze has provided quite a good environment for co-learning with farmers, and also a great environment for developing a relationship between farmers and researchers. And that relationship is a really important relationship, and Evergraze has been very good at that.
I guess if you were to say to someone, the biggest thing you've taken out of Evergraze, you know, if someone went up to you in the pub and said, what's the one thing you've taken from Evergraze, from everything, what's the one biggest learning?
Okay. My biggest learning from Evergraze, I think, was to keep it simple. The rotational grazing has been a pivotal change to our efficiencies. I think Evergraze is very good at teaching you to seek for the evidence before you embark on a change. And from a philosophical perspective, I think that's probably the biggest learning through Evergraze, is to seek the evidence. Don't tackle things with a religious fervour. Seek the evidence before you make the change, because there's always good science to back up a good answer. And I really like that.
I don't know how well you'll be able to answer this question considering the circumstances, but so you've been able to increase production now, you've brought on the Evergraze principles. Where's the next stage? What's the next step for you now?
Yep. Yep, you're right. We've been managing Womargama with Evergraze type principles for quite some time now, and we wonder where the next big leap of efficiency is. I'm not sure that there is. I think we have a recipe now, and the thing to do is to do that to the best of your ability. We utilise our resources, sunlight, fertiliser, soil, academic capital, to turn those resources into a product with the best genetics and the best, most efficient system to create the biggest profit we can. I think we're continually refining that. We're continually seeking the barriers, the little bits that we're just not doing as well as we might, and finding the answers for those. And those little pieces combine to create big efficiencies. So I'm not looking for one great big blue sky answer to drive productivity. I'm continually looking for those little bits to do better.
Is there anything else that you think we've missed that you want to cover, Chris?
Can I grab that?
Go. Prior to joining the whole Evergraze principle, or prior to joining Evergraze, what were some of the barriers that you saw yourself facing that you were able to overcome with the help of Evergraze?
I might say what I was going to say rather than answer that. Evergraze, sorry, I looked straight at the camera then. One of the things I found through my relationship with Evergraze was that when I look back at some of those things that looked like an insurmountable barrier, I look back at them now and see that they're really just excuses. And we've been able to achieve some wonderful things with the support of the Evergraze ideals and principles and team, particularly that concept of seeking the evidence, convincing yourself and making the change. This is Womargama Station. As you can see, it's made up of a valley with some distinct different land classifications through it. We've got some beautiful heavy flats that grow some lucerne, unfortunately not enough of those. We've got some wonderful phalaris paddocks. We've got the rising slopes, which are very productive, predominantly sown to phalaris, and then we've got some spectacular native country in that rising shale country. The different land classifications provide challenges and opportunities. And in managing Womargama Station, learning how to get each land classification to contribute to its maximum potential within a whole farming system is one of the wonderful challenges, and one of the things where Evergrey has been very helpful. What else can I say? This is Womargama Station. You notice that it's a valley running through steep hills. It has quite a large variety of soil types and aspect and steepness. No, it hasn't got it right. I haven't got that either. Start again. This is Womargama Station. You can see that it's a valley with significantly different types of environment. No, I haven't got it, sorry. This is Womargama Station. You can see that it's a valley with steep hills on either side. There's quite a lot of different country through Womargama, different soil types, different aspects, different pasture species. Each of those different environments requires different management. It's been really interesting piecing it together over the years. You'll see that our heavy flats are beautifully suited to growing lucerne and highly improved pasture species, particularly Phalaris. Our mid-slopes are also very good for Phalaris and produce about 14 DSEs to the hectare. Our backcountry is native pastures, running between 2 and 4 DSEs to the hectare. Putting that suite together of how to manage all of those types of land classifications together in the one farming system to bring out the best of each type of land has been a very interesting process, and Evergrey has been great help in sorting that out. Is that good, bad?
Very good, very good. No, that was really good. Building on what you already know.
Yeah, right. Embracing change is one of the really important things as we go forward in managing farms, particularly in increasing productivity growth, looking for new technologies, searching for that thing that you don't do as well as you might. One of the things that we think is very important is seeking the evidence, getting the science. One of the other things that I think is extremely important is not letting go of those things that you already do well. Keeping, no, I haven't got that.
No, you're doing great, just pick it up.
All right, pick it up again. Keeping those things that you do really well, keeping those things that you know are important profit drivers and adding to them. Things like response to phosphorus, we know the answers to all of that. So let's not lose that, but let's build that into a suite of new technologies, building on some of those wonderful foundations. Now, what else can I say? During the drought, because it was so traumatic, we were now let's start again. The point I want to get across is during the drought, lots of people just lost it. Managing Womargama Station through the drought was a tremendous challenge. Like all farm managers, it was a tough time. And we were really fighting for survival the whole time. And at the end of the drought, now that it's broken, many of us have perhaps forgotten some of those key profit drivers that were key principles before. And so it's really timely to revisit some of those key principles, I think. What else?
Whenever you're ready, we're ready to go here.
You right to go?
Yep.
Okay. Vicky, personally, thanks for having us here. Thanks
Pleasure.
for turning on the weather. It's a great day. Just to start, could you maybe paint a picture of your farm? So, like, what enterprise you got, the size, and where we are.
We're Holbrook, southern New South Wales. Our farm's 15 k's north of Holbrook, east of the highway, which makes quite a difference rainfall-wise. We've got 1,900 hectares of land that we manage. Annual rainfall is 700 mil. Last 2 years we've had over 1,000 mils each year, so we've actually effectively been green for the last 24 months here now, which is good but also pose problems. Soils are sort of brown loams, slightly acid soils and aluminium at depth, so there are a few issues as far as pasture establishment or perennial pasture establishment. We run a predominantly sheep-based enterprise. We run 14,000 to 15,000 merino sheep. we sit somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 merino ewes. Portion of those, usually about a third, is joined to a terminal sire each year, but the rest are self-replacing merino flock. It's a fine wool enterprise, so our average micron at the moment is 18 micron. We used to sit at about 21, but in the last 8 years we've dropped those 3 micron and held clean fleece weight. Yes, we are increasing a proportion of wethers in our flock as a bit of a climatic safety net, but at the moment we're predominantly a ewe-based enterprise.
How did you drive the enterprise to drop those 3 microns?
Genetics, pretty much. We inherited a 2,000 head ewe flock when Tony and I started running the farm, and Tony being my husband. And while they were a very easy care flock, in the current wool market at the time, it wasn't a particularly economic flock. And so we sat down, we decided we're either going to get out of sheep or we've got to improve the economics of that flock. And so we put a lot of time, money and effort into selecting a different genetic path and bringing those genetics in very quickly. So we actually started up a ram breeding nucleus, did a lot of ET work, sourced semen from what we thought was the best genetic sources we could find, and have made that drop due to genetics pretty much.
Really good. You're a natural with this. How long ago did you get involved in Evergraze? Could you maybe paint that picture of...
Evergraze, I would say probably 3 years ago, actively involved. I'm a bit of a information hoover, and so had read a lot of what was coming out of Evergraze. Tony, my husband, was actively involved in Holbrook Land Care, and when the proof sites were set up in Holbrook, he had sort of been involved through that, and we went to a very early field day at Stuart Anderson's and John Vagona's site about native pastures, but on this property we don't run a huge amount of native area. But 3 years ago, Kate Sargent delivered a rotational / strategic grazing course in Holbrook, and I got on board on that, and it was probably one of the best courses I've done in a very long time. And from there I've sort of become more actively involved in the machinations of Evergraze.
Now, Evergraze is all about the right plant, the right place, right principles, right management. What are you bringing on from Evergraze into your farm, into your business?
Perennials have always been a major part of the system here. The soils tend to, being high rainfall, 700 mils, the soils can get very waterlogged in winter and actually are quite erodible. It doesn't look like it as well. There's a little creek there after the last couple of years. But so Tony's family had always been interested in putting perennials in the landscape, and had put a lot of trees back in the landscape to try and, I suppose, capture that rainfall, turn it into a product, but also to sort of protect the soils. They did a lot of work when direct drilling came into being and started trying to put Phalaris in the landscape. And then when Tony and I took over the farm, that sort of technology was really sort of hitting its peak. The economics of farming were there to lime this country and to sow it down to perennial pasture. And so in the last 8-10 years, we've gone from probably the farm being 20% to a third perennials to being, well, probably 90% of grazed area in Phalaris subclover based pastures. For us, it stabilises the land and delivers us a great predictable feed wedge, and we also think that it allows you to utilise whatever rainfall falls on your property. So we've got less runoff, it's more infiltration, and then we can turn that into feed. Coming out of Evergraze, so not only have we put more Phalaris back in the landscape, but we're now looking at trying to put a bit more lucerne back in the landscape, which will give us a bit more responsiveness in the summer period as well.
I just want to go back and touch on some of the stuff you were talking about, how it lets you utilise whatever rainfall you've got. Paint the picture on how it works when you get below your average 700 mil rainfall, and what differences it makes when you get these years of 1,000 mils.
Well, in the drought, the peak of the drought, which I would call 06-07 here, we received 280 mil rainfall, and in that particular year there was no or very little growth in that spring, summer, autumn period. But what we found is that once the autumn break came, and we'd recognised that our perennial pastures were our capital asset. So the stock, but the pastures needed nurturing, so we destocked everything, and were in stock containment areas. So even though it looked desolate, when the autumn break happened, it was amazing how quickly the country recovered, and the perennial species were there and they recovered quickly, and they gave us a bulk of dry matter very early. The annual pastures that are here all sort of so yes, they sort of look green quickly, but they don't give you the bulk of the dry matter, whereas the perennial pastures really bounced back, and we were incredibly pleased with how resilient they'd been. And I think they have to be resilient. The economics of putting them in, the sowing them, one of the things I like about Evergraze is that it balances animal production and the persistence of that capital asset being your pasture, and so that you get long-term return on investment for that pasture establishment.
You're looking at bringing in Lucerne back into the system. Why did you maybe not rely on it so much in the past?
Well, we did pre-drought. We did have some Lucerne in, not a large area. Our country's not particularly conducive for Lucerne. And in the drought, it just didn't hold on. Our thinking has sort of starting to change a bit, having looked at some of the results out of the Wagga Evergraze site. One of our biggest feed gaps now is merino weaner summer feed. Depending on how many crossbred lambs we keep, we usually have over 4,000 merino weaners to keep alive, and then crossbred lambs that we can make the decision whether to sell as stores or to finish. So summer high protein feed is an absolute premium. We've done quite a lot of work with brassicas, but it's an annual investment, and so we started looking at Lucerne again, and looking at why Lucerne probably didn't persist over the drought, and we'd probably tended to go for more high performance winter active species, whereas our current thinking is that maybe we go with a less winter active species, and that actually the economics of maybe it's not going to be a 10 or 15 year Lucerne stand for us, but if we can get sort of 7 or 8 years, it actually stacks up against annual brassica turnover. Brassica will still stay part of our production system, but we think if we have a portion of Lucerne, then it'll give us a bit of balance. How the numbers on that work out, we'll wait and see.
How well has implementing the Evergraze principles and the Evergraze strategy, how well has it achieved the outcomes not only from a ground cover environmental outcome, but also from a productivity profitability outcome?
For us, it's been brilliant. We find how we've adopted Evergraze principles is we run large mobs of sheep, so we haven't carved our paddocks up into smaller lots, so our paddocks still sit at sort of 30 or 40 hectares. So we run, as you can see in the background here, mobs of 2,500 sheep in one mob, and they move strategically around the pastures based on growth stage and dry matter available. For us, it has allowed us to run a higher stocking rate, so sort of greater production per hectare. It's allowed us to monitor feed available and plan our feed budgets going forward, and hopefully alert us to when we're coming to a squeeze or when the season doesn't look to be going in our favour earlier, and to plan for that. I also think that we've been able to maintain a more consistent feed profile. So there's less sort of boom and bust and less senescing pasture. So there's the quality, I think, is more consistent. In these big boom years, I think the big mobs have been essential for Phalaris pastures because you haven't had great big stands of rank Phalaris. We've been able to keep them down in their vegetative state and high quality feed. It will be interesting to go back to dry summers and late autumns, and I think we've sort of forgotten how to manage those a little bit, and getting our head back round that feed profile.
Any idea when they will come?
I'd love to say never, but wet years have their issues, especially animal health issues as well. And I would say for us this system works incredibly well. I would say unless you want to actively manage your stock, you know, the bigger mobs do have more animal health issues that you have to keep on top of. But having said that, you actually have to monitor less mobs around the farm. So if you are monitoring them when you're moving them, it's easy to keep on top of things as well.
You do have some cropping as part of your business. How well does, say, the grazing and the cropping work together?
For us, brilliantly. The cropping, this was never cropping property, and then after the drought we had what were our remaining annual pasture paddocks, which had been used as a bit of the sacrifice during the drought. And looking at the economics of how to get them quickly into perennial pastures, or relatively quickly into perennial pastures, we thought, well, if they go into a cropping phase, the crop can effectively pay for the lime and clean them up, and then we'll get beautiful pasture establishment. So that's where it came about, but it also, grazing crops for us fill the winter feed gap. So I think they will stay in the system, and we will try to stabilise the rotation as far as crop and pasture establishment. So we start moving back round the farm into there's a few paddocks on this place that have 50-year-old Phalaris stands from Tony's grandfather. So they will come back into a cropping phase, and so the crop, I think, fits snugly in the production system at the moment.
Where to next? Where are you hoping to take your farm, say, in the next 5 years?
Still wanting to increase the flock size. Oh gosh,
Yeah,
touch micro.
That's all right. Start that one again.
Start again. Going forward and into the future, we're still wanting to increase our flock size, but we'll do that in a sort of a steady state increase, looking at seasons and as we develop more, put more perennial pastures in and improve varieties, sort of track that stocking rate increase. I think cropping will stay part of the system because it just fills a nice feed gap, and you know, it allows us to put lime out and things like that. I would like to solve the problem of summer, you know, this protein issue. Hopefully we're moving down a path that will deliver that, but you know, time will tell. Some of the new work that's coming out on lotus and bits and pieces that may also fit into the picture in a later date. I suppose for us what we're looking at is trying to develop a really sustainable, resilient system, and that's both a sort of an environmental as well as a production system, and to give us the lifestyle as a young couple with a young family that we're after.
Would you be able to go into a bit more detail in your involvement on the National Advisory Committee and the upper level of the actual Evergraze project?
For me, I came from a government background. I worked in Canberra for a while, and I'd moved to the farm, and I'd been given, you know, management of the sheep flock to keep me out of trouble. But I like getting my head around the strategic things that are happening in the industry and where the industry is heading. And I had the opportunity after doing the grazing course to apply for one of the producer positions that was becoming available on the NAC. And for me, it's a great way to tap into what is happening nationally and what is the research that's coming out, but just as importantly for us to feed back as producers what we think is important for our systems, both environmentally and production-wise, and to get that cross-pollination between producers and scientists and the policy makers and funders, so that there's ownership on all levels, and that we have a pathway forward that will deliver for producers, but will also deliver sort of triple bottom line outcomes for everyone involved.
How important do you think it is to get that cross-pollination, especially between producers and researchers?
I think essential. I think having come from a science policy background, I think it can be a huge dislocation between pure science and actually applying it on ground. And you get a lot of articles that come out in the media and publications that not dumb it down, but they make it quite broad brush. So it's very difficult for a producer to be able to make substantial changes to their farm based on sort of quite, sort of basic intro information. So I think to get that good adoption pathway, you really need to link both ends of the spectrum, and to actually get farmers telling scientists how they would like information delivered and what is relevant, and vice versa, so that funders get return on investment for money going into research, and us as producers get answers to questions that we are pondering in our own heads.
Outside of Evergraze, have you, due to your involvement, say with the NAC and Holbrook Landcare, have you been able to enhance, I guess, your networks with researchers?
Yes, I seem to be getting asked to sit on a lot of committees and people. I think if you put your hand up and get involved, and you are genuinely interested, then people will come asking for your input, and I think it's a great way to as a producer, I get to meet the primary source of this information coming out, and you get wonderful people on the end of the phone you can ring up and ask questions to. But I think there's a huge body of people that are doing work for the industry who would like to know, more about what producers want day to day, and how to tap into that information seems to be an ongoing sort of problem.
Have you had many people come up to you and ask you about Evergraze as far as other farmers around the district?
Yes, probably. Holbrook's probably a bit of a funny case, because a lot of the producers that would have initially been interested did this grazing course. So there's quite a high understanding of Evergraze and the principles in this particular area. I think it will be interesting to see how that then filters out to the next sort of geographical areas and sort of different types of farmers who are, how that gets picked up and taken on from now. But Holbrook has quite, I think, because of all the research work here and proof sites and the grazing course that was run, there's actually a very high level of understanding and uptake in this part of the world.
And just say you got a cold call from a farmer out of the blue asking you what's all this Evergraze about, and what should I be thinking, what would your response be?
I suppose I would try and explain that it's a bit of a sorry, I might have to start that again. I'm just trying to think best how to. I think Evergraze for me is it's a wonderful suite of tools and information that allows a farmer to look at their country and assess the needs of that country, as far as environmental needs, as far as what the landscape needs, as soil health and water retention and those sort of issues, and balance that with production. So can look at the species that can go into the landscape and deliver for that producer. For me, Evergraze has allowed me to put the right species in the right place and get a superior production benefit from having those, and understanding. So once you've made that investment and put those species in place, Evergraze I think gives you the tools to then utilise that resource and protect that resource. And for me, I think that's what I would be telling any farmer who is coming on. If they're interested in increasing their environmental and production benefits on their farm through pasture species and production, then Evergraze I think gives you the tools to do it.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add that you don't think we've covered, or you want to cover?
I was just trying to think if this thing. Evergraze I think is applicable across the landscape and across a variety of production systems. I think the strength of Evergraze is that it's not prescriptive. It gives some wonderful tools that if you want to take them as a package and implement them as, an A to B package, then it's all there for you. But it also gives farmers the capacity to do some learning and understand the principles of, pastures in the right place, how to manage them, how to manage your livestock nutritional requirements, and then match that with your feed base. So it allows farmers to upskill, I hate the word, but to develop those skills and understanding so that they can then create a production system from the Evergraze principles that works for them. It's not a if you don't implement everything, then it's that's sort of not what Evergraze is about.
So a farmer implementing Evergraze principles at, say, Armidale is going to have a different. It's going to look completely different to what we've got here in Holbrook.
It's going to look completely different. The production system Evergraze production system in Armidale will look very different physically to a Evergraze production system in Holbrook, but I think the principles underlying both will be, very, very similar, if not identical. I think the things that change in the picture are personal preferences, so people's lifestyle requirements, people's capital availability, and those things will be the things that will change, whether paddocks are split into, smaller acreages or water points are changed or whatever. I think they're the things that are different, but the principles underlying it are all very similar.
That's great.
Really good.
Done?